Today's topic, we're going to be looking at fat loss. Even amongst healthy, obese people, they have a higher risk of mortality, cardiovascular disease, and cancer. No matter how you slice it, the majority of people who lose weight will put most of it or all of it back on. They're eating 1,100 calories per day. They're also eating a ton of sugar, a lot of carbohydrate, their insulin levels are high, and yet they lost massive amounts of weight. Shouldn't be possible based on what some of these social media influencers say, but here we are. You should believe me because when I make a claim, I cite direct evidence in support of that claim. What's up, guys? Welcome back to the Dr. Layne Norton podcast. I am your host. You guessed it, Layne Norton. So today's topic, we're going to be looking at fat loss. What really works? Now, this is a topic that I think probably, if I had to guess, over half the people who follow me for this topic. When I look at which one of my posts get the most engagement, when I look at what goal setting on our app, Carbon Diet Coach, gets the most engagement most goal generation, it's by far fat loss. People want to lose fat. People want to be leaner. And for multiple reasons. Obviously, there are the health implications of obesity. We'll probably cover those a little bit more in depth in another episode. I want to keep this episode strictly focused on what works for fat loss, what are the most important movers of fat loss. But beyond the health implications of obesity and trying to lose weight to not be obese or reduce adiposity, there are also other things to consider. Some people want to look good naked. Some people want to, say, do photo shoots. And some people even want to get shredded for physique competitions. Now, those are a very small sliver of the population, but that is one that I fell into from 2001 to 2010. I competed competitively in bodybuilding, in drug-tested bodybuilding. I've always competed drug-free. And I got very, very lean. In fact, I won my Natural Pro card in 2006 at age 24. And then I went on to compete in a series of pro shows in 2010. And I even won the heavyweight division at the 2010 IFPA Pro International, which was definitely the highlight of my bodybuilding career. And then I also prepped, I would say, over 500 people for physique competitions. And I turned over 70 people pro, either in drug-tested or non-tested bodybuilding or physique or figure or bikini. I worked with people across the gamut. I worked with IFBB pros, which are the massive untested bodybuilders. I worked with drug-free bikini competitors. I spanned the whole gamut. And so fat loss became the topic that I was probably most interested in, was hired for to help people with most. And again, it's what I get asked about the most because I think the statistics now are over half of people are considered obese. And I think over 70% of adults are considered overweight. So this is a massive, massive problem. Without getting too much into the ramifications of this, obesity or excess adipose tissue drastically increases your risk of type 2 diabetes, increases your risk of cardiovascular disease, increases your risk of cancer, and increases your risk of mortality. And those risks hold even when you correct for other variables. For example, for a while, we thought that obesity was only problematic for people that had abnormal blood markers or were type 2 diabetic. And now we have quite a few studies and meta-analyses showing that even amongst healthy obese individuals, people with normal blood lipids, normal insulin sensitivity, even amongst healthy obese people, they have a higher risk of mortality, cardiovascular disease, and cancer. Adipose tissue, which is fat tissue, is an endocrine organ. We used to believe that adipose tissue was kind of this inert tissue that was kind of like a sponge. And if you ate too much, it soaked up the excess energy and stored it. And if you didn't eat enough, it was like squeezing a sponge out. It released the energy and it gave you energy to fuel your metabolism, your physiological processes and whatnot. And now we know that, yes, the adipose tissue does do that, But adipose tissue is very, very complicated, and it is basically an endocrine organ. It sends out hormonal signals. It sends out adipokines, which are adipose-derived inflammatory cytokines. It integrates hormonal signals from other tissues. It fits every definition of an endocrine organ. And so we cannot view it anymore as this inert tissue, and we cannot view fat loss or fat gain in the context of it's just something to do with vanity. It's not. There's a lot of far-reaching implications of excess adiposity. On the same token, I want to point out that you don't have to be shredded to be healthy. So if we look at the risk of mortality and levels of adiposity or levels of body fat, it's kind of a J-shaped curve. So at high levels of adiposity, you have drastically increased risk of cardiovascular disease, cancer, mortality. But at very, very low levels of body fat, you also have increased risks of mortality. Now, some of those are driven by people with very, very low body fat tend to have greater risk of disordered eating. They tend to have other kind of psychological disorders, I want to say. They tend to be very anxious. There's a lot of things that play into that. But you don't have to be shredded to be healthy. In fact, the research suggests that in men, probably anywhere from 15 to 20% body fat is a completely healthy body fat level that you can be very, very healthy at. And that's not shredded. That's kind of like your dad bod kind of bod. And then for women, probably anywhere from 20 to 30% body fat. So you don't have to be shredded. The idea that you need to have a six-pack to be healthy is complete nonsense. You don't need a six-pack, and just having a six-pack does not mean you're healthy. And just to let you guys in on a little secret, the fitness models that you see that have six-packs, I don't want to paint with too broad of a brush, but in general, they fall into a few different categories. One, they do stay that lean all the time and they're drug-free and they are miserable. They have low libido. They don't go out to eat. They don't have much of a social life, and they have drastically altered mood states. In fact, in a study of natural bodybuilders nearing competition, they found mood disturbances that were quite severe. And I can attest anecdotally, when I was very, very lean, I had absolutely no libido. My testosterone was tanked. I had very low energy. I'm a very social person. I didn't want to talk to anybody. I didn't want to be around anybody. It changed my personality. It's one of the reasons I stopped competing. I'm not dogging competing. I think bodybuilding is a great sport for a lot of different reasons, but being very, very lean for that period of time is really hard on you. The next category would be people who stay that lean and take performance-enhancing drugs, which obviously there are downsides to those. And then the third category would be people who get really shredded for a short period of time, do a bunch of photo shoots, take a ton of photos, and then that's all they post on social media. And so you get a very filtered view of what is actually out there. So I just wanted to give you some of the realities of the backstory of why people may want to lose body fat, why you may not need to lose body fat, even if you think you do. In fact, being in the fitness industry absolutely skewed my perceptions of what is a healthy body fat. Looking back, me being at a healthy body fat of like 15%, I thought I was fat. And if I post pictures on message boards, this is back before social media, I would get made fun of because people would make fun of my physique because they said I was too fat. And that can really skew your perception. And now it's gotten even worse because social media has created an environment where people only post their highlights. Very few people are posting, at least for competitors or fitness models, they're not posting their like off-season shots where they're, up by 10% body fat. Nobody, once you've been that lean, you don't want to show off anything else. So it can absolutely skew your perception. So I just want to bring you guys back to reality that the purpose of this episode is not to try to convince you that you need to get a six-pack or anything like that. The purpose of this episode is that if you do want to lose body fat for whatever reason, I'm going to walk you through what actually works, what actually matters for fat loss, and some of the things that you probably don't even really need to worry about. If you guys want to learn more about this after the episode, obviously we have my notes available online that are fully referenced. If you want to go much deeper into this, I would really recommend my book, Fat Loss Forever. You can find this at biolayneStore.com. This book is kind of my fat loss manifesto. I wrote it a while back, but the principles still persist. It's still, I think, very, very accurate. And it will provide you a great blueprint of how to set up a fat loss diet. And not only that, it goes deep, very deep, very deep into the science behind fat loss, weight maintenance, and everything in between. So I highly recommend this book. It's a great book. If you guys are interested, I'll link it in the show notes with a discount code. So go check that out. I think you guys will love it. And if you don't like doing math, you don't like doing calculations, you just want something to take care of it yourself, then my app, Carbon Diet Coach, everything I talk about in this episode, everything I talk about in the book, all those principles are integrated into Carbon Diet Coach, and it will do all of the mathematical work for you, the adjustments, all that kind of stuff. You have to worry about it. All you have to do is just follow what it says and you'll get results. Very easy and less than $10 a month. So with that sales pitch out of the way, let's get into fat loss. Now, there's a lot of confusion around fat loss. We used to think that any problem we had in society was an information problem. If we just had more information, people could make the right decision. And then the internet came around and we figured out that that is not the case. It is not an information problem or a lack of information problem. It's actually a too much information problem. In fact, over 87%, it's estimated, of social media fitness claims are false. Not only that, even though some of the claims out there are true, a lot of them are focused on things that don't really matter that much. Just using hypothetical numbers. If I can get you to do something and put your energy into something that's going to give you an 80% return on investment, okay? But somebody else is talking about something with the same intensity and fervor and seemingly level of importance as what I'm talking about that's going to give you 1% return. If you are not well educated in the area, you're going to have a really difficult time picking apart which one is more important. And a lot of time what I find is we have to realize that people have limited time, resources, and mental capacity. And if we get them focused on things that don't really matter that much, if we blow up the importance of things that don't really matter that much, then people are going to get frustrated because they're putting time, effort, and energy and money into something that isn't giving them the return that they need. So in this episode, I'm really going to try and lay out the things that are actually important for fat loss, what works, why it works, and give you guys a blueprint for what you need to put your energy, time, and money into. And I've included a figure from my book, Fat Loss Forever. I would slightly amend this figure if I go back and rewrite this book, which is I would add sleep on there, and you'll see where I put it into the hierarchy. For the most part, this figure is very, very accurate. I adapted it from Eric Helms's book, The Muscle and Strength Guide Pyramid, which I also recommend if you guys are looking to build muscle and want to know what's important versus what's not. Eric's a friend and a great, great writer and a great researcher, so highly recommend that as well. I adapted, with his permission, that pyramid from his book for fat loss. So it goes from most important to least important. So you can check that out in the show notes as well, or you can just get the book Fat Loss Forever, and it's in there and fully explained. So based on our best estimates on social media, there are hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of posts made yearly around weight loss. And research shows when it comes to what do people pay attention to, they don't pay attention to experts, they pay attention to star power. What they found is celebrities and politicians will get far more influence over people's decision-making than actual subject matter experts. And again, this has led to widespread confusion about what matters for actual weight loss. All you need to do now is look at, for example, RFK, or Robert Kennedy Jr., look at his claims about, say, seed oils or vaccines or these sorts of things. And you can see somebody who really doesn't have a lot of education on the matter getting a lot of attention. And now I don't want to become political, but just being completely transparent, RFK is working for the Republican Party now, essentially. And I am somebody who comes from a conservative family, and I myself would not consider myself a straight down the line conservative, but I would consider myself a fiscal conservative and tend to vote that way. So this is somebody who is working for a party that is more in line with my bias. And still, I am telling you that this individual is not someone I would consider educated on these matters. And moreover, the person who's been tagged as the Surgeon General by our president, I don't know when this episode will drop, but at the moment, Casey Means just got nominated. And while she isn't the worst I've seen out there, some of her social media posts have been very, very misleading, and some of her interviews have been very, very misleading. And I do not consider her a subject matter expert in nutrition either. So with all these things being true, how do people pick out what is true versus what is not true? When you have people who have a lot of fame or great credentials or both making some of these claims. Now, I'm not going to tell you should believe me because I have a PhD. I'm not going to tell you should believe me because I got to lower levels of body fat than probably 99.99% of human beings. You should not believe me because I won a pro card in bodybuilding. You should not believe me because I won a pro show in bodybuilding. You should not believe me because I coached over 500 people for competition prep and over 2,000 people over the course of 20 years, one-on-one. You should not believe me just because I have a coaching company, Team Biolayne, that has worked with over 10,000 people for some of these goals. You should not believe me because I helped build an app, Carbon Diet Coach, that's helped hundreds of thousands of people meet their nutrition goals. You should not believe me because I wrote a book on fat loss. You should not believe me because I've published peer-reviewed literature. You should believe me because when I make a claim, I cite direct evidence in support of that claim. That is why you should believe me. No other reason. And in honor of that, when I do episodes like this, I make my own notes available for you all with all the citations that are clickable so you can go through and see for yourself that I'm not full of it. So with all that preamble out of the way, let's get into fat loss and what really matters. Now, a lot of people think that we have a weight loss problem in our society. And yeah, we kind of do. People have trouble losing fat. But more so, we have a problem with weight loss maintenance. There's research to show that obese people will at some point lose a significant amount of body weight in their life. The issue is the vast majority will put it back on. Now, there's all kinds of statistics thrown around. I've been guilty of this where 95% of diets fail. They put the weight back on, or 80% or 70%. It depends on the parameters you use for inclusion with this criteria. For example, if you are saying the weight loss has to be at least 5%, they have to maintain it for a year, then you're going to see lower percentage of weight regain. If you say 10% and they have to maintain it for 2 years, you're going to see a much higher percent of weight regain, probably around 70 or 80%. And if you look out, 3+ years at over 10% of body weight loss maintenance, then you're going to see upwards of 90% most likely. So no matter how you slice it, the majority of people who lose weight will put most of it or all of it back on. And amongst those people who re-add weight, 1/3 to 2/3 will add more than they previously had. So they actually end up overall worse off than they started. Now, some people have used that to say that dieting makes you fat, and dieting doesn't make you fat. There's no magic that happens. There is no starvation mode. It doesn't exist. People talk about this. It doesn't exist. If you went to the concentration camps in World War II, you didn't come across people who were randomly obese because they weren't eating enough. This did not happen. Starvation mode does not exist. Now, there are changes in energy expenditure with weight loss, and we'll discuss those. But if you are eating low calories, you will lose weight. So why do people regain? Well, people do not sustain the habits and lifestyle that they use to lose the weight to then maintain the weight. Moreover, your biology does work against you. There is a biological drive to regain weight back to pre-diet weight, sometimes more. And this is from a few different things. First off, your energy expenditure. We'll talk about this in detail here in a little bit, but your energy expenditure decreases when you lose weight. So you burn less calories. And your hunger signals increase. And so at both ends of the energy balance spectrum, you have changes in metabolism, hormonal signals to the brain sensitivity to those hormonal signals, driving you back to caloric surplus or maintenance, trying to get you back to your original pre-diet weight. What matters based on the evidence? Well, the number one thing that matters for weight loss, mechanically, what must occur is you have to place yourself in an energy deficit or a calorie deficit. We will use the terms energy and calories interchangeable because calories are literally a measurement of energy. So I will use the two terms interchangeably. You have to place yourself in a calorie deficit, meaning you are expending more calories than you consume. We'll talk about this in detail in a little bit. But you have to do that in order to lose weight. And then when you get to your goal weight, you have to be at maintenance, meaning you have to at least consume the amount of calories that you are expending. If you exceed that over time, you will regain weight. And we see this based on research data showing that amongst various broad different types of diets, low fat, low carb, ketogenic, balanced, amongst all those diet types, there's no difference in long-term weight loss. But when you stratify by adherence, by subject adherence to the diet, regardless of the type of diet used, there is a linear effect of adherence on weight loss success. Put simply, I'm going to kind of jump to the end here, but put simply, the best diet for you for fat loss is probably the diet that you can most easily stick to. So it is adherence to the calorie deficit that is the most important factor. Not adherence some of the time, not adherence Monday through Friday and do whatever you want on the weekends, but consistent adherence to a calorie deficit. Now, I'm not saying you have to be in a calorie deficit every single day, but over the course of time, over the course of weeks, months, you must be overall in a net calorie deficit in order to lose weight. Some of you watching this are probably going, I ate in a calorie deficit, I didn't lose weight. Not over time you didn't. And I'm going to explain why you weren't in a calorie deficit, even though you might have thought you were. So before you rage and throw something at your TV, computer screen, or your radio, please give me the chance to explain coming up here. Now, let's just focus on adherence. How can you improve adherence? What are the factors that are associated with better adherence in research studies? And we do have quite a few studies, systematic reviews looking at the characteristics of successful weight loss maintainers. So people who have lost weight and kept it off. So what are the factors that improve adherence? Well, one is self-efficacy. Basically, do you have an intrinsic reason, motivation? If you are doing it for outside reasons, or if you're doing it to please somebody, or if you're doing it because your doctor told you to do it, or for whatever reason, it's going to be less effective. You're going to have less reason to adhere to it. It has to be something internal. It has to be an internal drive. And that's difficult to do. It's hard to switch that on. And, I'm going to talk about my friend Ethan Suplee now. And for those of you who are not familiar, first off, Ethan has his own podcast called American Glutton. Highly recommend you check it out. And hopefully we'll have him as a guest on the show sometime. Ethan was a Hollywood actor. You may recognize him from films such as Remember the Titans, American History X, and the series My Name is Earl. Ethan was over 500 pounds for most of his career. And he tried all different types of diets. He lost weight, regained it, And finally, he lost over 300 pounds and sustained it and still sustains it to this day. When he tells the story of what got him to change, it's similar to drug addicts when they talk about what got them to change. Basically, he just got sick and tired of it. He just decided one day, my life is not going to be like this. And he had that internal motivation to change. Not to get too philosophical with you guys, but one of my favorite motivational speakers, Eric Thomas, he has a quote, which is, when the pain of staying the same becomes greater than the pain of change, that is when we change. And I'll give another example. This isn't with diet and exercise or obesity, but with my own brother who was a drug addict. And I was speaking with my brother one time, and, he had went to prison for a while, and eventually he turned his life around. And I asked him, what was it that changed things for you? Like, was going to prison, was that your rock bottom? And he said, no. He said, I just woke up one day and I realized that I lose everything. I get a relationship and I lose it. I get a job and I lose it. I get some money and I lose it. And I just got tired of losing. He said it so cavalierly, but it really felt like a very profound thing. It was really an internal decision that he came to. Now, some people, they do have their, rock bottom. They get arrested. They go through a divorce, whatever have you. I saw a story when I was at the competition of a guy who lost like 150 pounds because he went to the doctor and he had like a 98% blockage in one of his arteries. And he decided that he wanted to be there to see his grandchildren born and play with his grandchildren. And that was his internal cue or his internal motivation. Whatever it is, you have to have something that you can fall back on when things get difficult, when things get hard, and it's going to get hard. What do you fall back on to tell yourself, this is why I'm doing it? Because you're not always going to be motivated. You're not always going to feel good. There are going to be hard days. And so having something to fall back on where you go, this is the reason, this is my why, that's very important. And that is kind of part of self-efficacy. You've probably heard me talk about my app, Carbon Diet Coach. That is because it is the best damn macro tracking and nutrition coaching app on the market. I use it, and so should you. I have packed all of my one-on-one nutrition coaching experience and my PhD knowledge into one simple app that will help you build muscle, lose fat, all for just a few dollars a week. It's so simple how it works. All you got to do is track your macros, weigh in regularly, and then check in every week, and our customized nutrition coaching algorithm will give you personalized macronutrient adjustments tailored to your goals and individual metabolism. No fad diets, no BS, just simple science that is guaranteed to work. Millions of pounds of fat have been lost and thousands of lives have been changed with Carbon. So what are you waiting for? Go to joincarbon.com/podcast to take the guesswork out of your diet. Next one is social support. Now, there are different forms of social support, and there are types of social support that help with weight loss and types that don't. The types of social support that help are somebody joining in with you, going to the gym with a buddy, having an accountability partner, going to exercise in a group setting, somebody who is also providing encouragement. But the type of social support that doesn't tend to work is when somebody is giving you feedback. Somebody is giving you criticism. Somebody, well, why don't you do this? Well, you could do this. Well, or kind of giving you instruction, unless you've hired them as like a coach, for example. Coaching is another form of social support that can be very, very helpful. Having somebody to be accountable to, that you, one, trust, and two, have a desire to make proud, can be a powerful, powerful tool. To be honest with you, weight loss coaching isn't really that complicated. It's not. On a mechanical level, you got to get people to calorie deficit. But how you get them there, how you get them to buy in, how you get them to trust the process, that is the difficult part. And that is where the art form of great coaching comes in. And something I talk about a lot with our team Biolayne coaches and in my coaching certification course, Physique Coaching Academy, because being a great coach is so much more than just numbers. The numbers are, I would say, less than 1% of it. Another thing that helps is social identification with a dietary approach. Now, this blade cuts both ways, but people who kind of invest themselves in a community around a diet tend to have better adherence. The problem with that is they can tend to get very dogmatic about their diets, where they are kind of these warring factions, and you see this all the time. Plant-based versus carnivore, keto versus plant-based. Those tend to be some of the biggest battles online. And then you've got some of the evidence-based people who are kind of in the middle who get attacked by all sides. But even though these types of people annoy me, this does appear to help with adherence, which is basically you're buying in. You are 100% invested in this as an identity. The next one was a little bit counterintuitive for me, which is greater initial weight loss. I'm somebody who talks about sustainability a lot because sustaining adherence, sustaining the calorie deficit, is the most important factor for losing body fat. So I was surprised to see that greater initial weight loss was associated with better long-term results and better weight loss maintenance. But I think there's some caveats here. The first one is people who lose weight more quickly early probably are just more adherent overall in general. The second is a lot of people who have tried multiple weight loss approaches, they don't trust the process. They're not bought in. But if they get some quick results right off the bat, some quick noticeable results, a big drop on the scale, now they get motivated, and now they are actually more likely to buy in and be adherent throughout the course of the process. So we have to remember that this isn't just physiology, it's also psychology. In fact, I think it's more psychology than it is physiology. If you get your mindset right, your body's going to follow. Your physiology is going to follow. So even though I used to think, well, we've got to go slow and steady, wins the race. I think initially, especially with people who are very obese or people who have multiple failed dieting attempts, getting them some early initial weight loss can be really helpful. This is why we also see better adherence typically on a ketogenic or low carb diet initially, because in addition to fat loss, you also get a pretty significant loss of body water. And even though that's not fat, they see that drop on the scale, and it's very motivating for a lot of people. Next one is tailoring the diet to the individual's preference. So there's studies that show, there's one in particular I'm thinking about with the Mediterranean diet, where they found that people who had an initial diet that was more similar to the fat loss diet they were placed on had better levels of adherence. This is not surprising to me because they're already kind of doing the lifestyle. They just need some slight modifications. That's a lot easier than some drastic lifestyle shift. In fact, oftentimes when I first started working with people who were Gen Pop, I would look at their current diet and just kind of go, where can we get some quick wins? And by quick wins, I mean, oh, you're drinking regular soda? Let's switch you to diet. Now, I know there's going to be the anti-diet soda crowd out there. We'll do an episode on that at some point. But switching to diet soda definitely helps based on the research data from regular soda. I mean, if you're having 3 regular sodas in a day, which is very, very normal for a lot of people, and you switch to diet, you are immediately saving almost 500 calories. You can't say this because it's not perfect math, but essentially about a pound a week of difference in weight loss. So switching to diet from regular is a very, very simple, easy way to get some quick wins. Then just doing some dietary swaps, using a smaller amount of cheese on some dishes, using a smaller amount of oil on some dishes, not using quite as much fat in cooking, swapping out some sugar in cooking for artificial sugar or low calorie, no calorie sugar substitute, having a salad where you are using a lower calorie dressing versus a full fat dressing. All these things can help you save calories, and just doing some of those swaps can easily save hundreds, if not over 1,000 calories in a day if you're somebody who's never been mindful about that stuff before. So when I was looking at people's diets, a lot of times I would try to see how can I make the smallest change with the biggest payoff. And I think there is a lot of validity to that. Next is increasing protein intake and fiber to a lesser extent. Higher protein diets have been shown to have better adherence levels. And also people who eat more fiber have an increased sense of fullness. And we'll talk about protein and fiber more coming up here. The next thing is self-monitoring through weighing yourself or logging your food. We're going to talk more about this later, but that which gets measured gets managed. If you are even weighing yourself, if you weigh yourself consistently, the evidence shows that you'll actually lose weight if you're an obese person. Because if you're watching something, you're not going to like what you see necessarily, and you might change your behavior because of it. And even if you just track your food, I can't tell you the number of times I had people who would come to me who wanted to lose fat. I'd say, you know what? For the first week, all I want you to do is track your food intake. I don't want you to change anything. All I want you to do is track it. And they'd come back and they'd lost 2 or 3 pounds in the first week. Why? Because just the monitoring itself got them much more mindful about what they were eating. And also, they realized they're going to have to show it to somebody, and so they were on their best behavior, right? It's kind of like the honeymoon phase in dating. But the reality is, if you self-monitor, it will improve your adherence and your results. Let's talk about the calorie deficit. Probably is going to be the most controversial part of this talk. And despite social media claims, calorie deficits produce weight loss regardless of the methodology used to establish the deficit. This is not up for debate. There's a lot of studies to show this. Now, some social media experts have claimed that you can't lose fat under certain conditions. Probably the most prevalent is if you're on a high carb diet, even if you're in a calorie deficit, you can't lose fat because insulin's elevated. And they claim this because insulin inhibits lipolysis and inhibits fat oxidation. Now, what are those two things? Well, part of the process of losing body fat is the liberation of fatty acids from adipose tissue. So your adipose tissue and the individual adipocytes, so an adipocyte is a fat cell, those cells store fat as triacylglyceride. I don't want to give you too much of a biochemistry lesson, but hey, you're here, why not? So triacylglycerides are essentially 3 fatty acids hooked to a glycerol head. Now, the benefit of this structure is you can pack a lot of energy in a small area. So fat tissue is very, very energetically dense. Okay, it's a great way to store energy. It is much more energy dense on a per gram basis compared to any kind of lean tissue. Even muscle glycogen, way more energy dense. You don't just get in a calorie deficit and poof, get energy from it. That's not how it works. You have to liberate those triacylglycerides, and that happens through the process of what's called lipolysis. And lipolysis occurs by an enzyme acting on the triacylglyceride to separate the fatty acids from the glycerol head. Those fatty acids, I'm skipping several steps, but those fatty acids can then enter a process called beta oxidation. Beta oxidation is where the fatty acid gets chopped into 2 carbon units of acetyl-CoA. And acetyl-CoA can enter the Krebs cycle or TCA cycle or citric acid cycle, depending on what you learned in college biology. Acetyl-CoA can enter the Krebs cycle, and that's used to produce eventually adenosine triphosphate, which is ATP. And ATP is the body's energy currency. So lipolysis and then fat oxidation are a part of the loss of body fat. But that's not the whole story. First off, the word inhibit doesn't mean block. It just means it reduces the activity of. Okay? And lipolysis and fat oxidation are part of fat loss, but they are not the full story. Your overall loss or gain of body fat is determined by something called fat balance, which is the balance between the fat you store versus the fat you oxidize or burn. Now, if you store more fat than you burn, you gain body fat. If you burn more fat than you store, you lose body fat. Now, it's important to point out you are always having these two processes occur simultaneously. Your body is always storing fat and burning fat at the same time. These are not on and off switches. You don't want to think about metabolism as on or off switches. That's not really how it works. You want to think about it more like dimmer switches, okay? The emphasis changes, but things don't turn on and off. So inhibition does not mean something completely shuts down. So that's the first thing. The second thing is understanding the dynamics between carbohydrates, blood glucose, insulin, and fats. When you eat carbohydrates, especially like starchy carbohydrates or sugar, your body releases insulin from the pancreas because high levels of sustained blood glucose are toxic. So you can't have blood glucose in your bloodstream for long. You need to shuttle it into the peripheral tissues like muscle, fat, and other tissues that need glucose to run, which is most of them. And so insulin is a key regulator. You can think about it as kind of a key. So take muscle tissue, for example. Muscle tissue is a closed door to glucose. When your body releases insulin or your pancreas releases insulin, the insulin molecule, the key, goes into the key lock and opens the door for glucose to go into the muscle cell. And that's done through a process called GLUT4 translocation. It's actually pretty cool. So you have glucose receptors that are, I don't want to say stored in the nucleus, but they kind of remain in the nucleus until insulin unlocks the door. And that sends a signal for these GLUT4 receptors to be translocated to the cell surface, and they allow glucose into the muscle cell. Pretty cool process. But insulin mediates it. So you need insulin to help dispose of this glucose. Well, insulin has other effects. It inhibits lipolysis, inhibits fat oxidation. So how can you lose body fat if you are inhibiting lipolysis and fat oxidation? Well, when you have carbohydrate in the bloodstream, you have to store it as muscle glycogen, and the excess has to be oxidized. You can't have it sitting around. And so if you're oxidizing glucose, your fat oxidation is going to drop because you have to oxidize the glucose. But glucose or dietary carbohydrate is not really stored as body fat. Like the actual molecules, the carbon skeletons from glucose don't really get stored to an appreciable degree in body fat. In fact, metabolic tracer studies show that less than 2% of the fats in adipose originate as carbohydrate. Therefore, over 98% of the fat you store in adipose originates as fat. So, let's take two drastically different diets, for example. High fat, low carb. Your insulin is low, your blood glucose doesn't go up much, so you are burning a lot of fat, but you're also eating a lot of fat, so you're also storing a lot of fat simultaneously. High carb, low fat. You have to oxidize the carbohydrate, insulin goes up, lipolysis is inhibited, fat oxidation is inhibited, so you're not burning as much fat, but you're also not storing as much fat because you're not eating much fat. The net difference is going to depend on energy balance. Are you consuming more calories than you're burning? And so when we look at the actual, I think this is the first time I get to do this on the podcast, maybe, human randomized control trials. When you look at the human RCTs where they do controlled feeding trials where people are having food provided to them and calories and protein are equated between diets, but they vary the amount of carbohydrate and fat, you see no real differences in the loss of actual body fat. In fact, low-fat diets in one meta-analysis, that's probably the best meta-analysis out there on this topic, low-fat diets actually caused slightly more fat loss to the tune of about 16 grams more fat loss per day. Now, that's a very small difference, and I'm not going to recommend somebody chase 16 extra grams of fat loss per day by doing a diet if they don't like the diet. But it's important to point out, it certainly doesn't favor the high-fat diets. And that's probably due to the fact that fat has a lower TEF, which we'll talk about later, thermic effect of food, and there's less steps for conversion from fat you eat to storing fat in adipose than there is with carbohydrate. So that alone should be enough to debunk the idea that you can't lose body fat if you have high insulin. And we even have individual RCTs looking at very, very low carbohydrate diets versus high carbohydrate diets, equal in calories and protein, with drastically different 24-hour levels of insulin, still showing similar amounts of fat loss. And there's studies showing even diets that are made up almost exclusively of sugar can produce massive weight loss when you have a substantial calorie deficit. I think it was called the grape juice and white rice diet. This is back in like 1975, this paper was published. And I think the average weight loss was something like over 100 pounds in these subjects, but they were eating 1,100 calories per day. Okay, well, they're also eating a ton of sugar, a lot of carbohydrate, their insulin levels are high, and yet they lost massive amounts of weight. Shouldn't be possible based on what some of these social media influencers say, but here we are. And honestly, another big nail on the coffin of this stuff is the GLP-1 mimetics, the current weight loss drugs like Ozempic, Wegovy, tirzepatide. These drugs actually increase insulin levels acutely. They increase insulin meal responses, but they cause massive reductions in appetite and massive weight loss. If it was not possible to lose weight, even in a calorie deficit with high insulin levels, these drugs should actually cause weight gain. They don't. They cause the exact opposite. They cause massive weight loss. So again, the idea that you can't lose fat because insulin is high in a calorie deficit is just not supported by any research data. Now let's talk about the calorie deficit. I'm thinking of the meme of Gollum out there. We do the calorie deficit, but we hates the calorie deficit. Any of my meme masters out there know what I'm talking about. So what's a calorie deficit? Well, it's expending more calories or energy than you consume. Sounds simple enough. And I think the simplicity of it gets people confused that because it's simple, it can't be correct because weight loss isn't easy. Therefore, something simple can't be the reason that you're losing weight. But try to keep in mind that simple does not mean easy. Saving money means you earn more than you spend. Very, very simple. And yet, I think it's something like over half of Americans live paycheck to paycheck. So simple in theory, difficult in execution. So what is a calorie? A lot of people who don't like the idea of energy balance will try to debunk, calories, because they'll say, well, a calorie is not actually a thing. It's a measurement of heat. So what does that have to do with weight loss? Well, it's great you asked. Energy is heat in its purest form. And that's why some of the first experiments looking at energy expenditure are looking at heat production. In fact, I believe one of the first experiments on this was looking at rodents in chambers with water surrounding the chamber and having those rodents eat and seeing how much heat was given off based on the change in the temperature of the water in the chamber. And wouldn't you know it, pretty much exactly the amount of heat generated was the amount of calories that were consumed. So yeah, calories matter. And yes, it's a measurement of heat, but heat is energy in its purest form. And so calories refer to the potential energy in the chemical bonds of food. That energy is liberated and transferred in the body throughout the course of metabolism. The entire existence of metabolism, the entire reason the metabolism happens is to try to capture this energy. And it captures this energy through the production of adenosine triphosphate, which is a high energy phosphate. And the hydrolysis of which basically means hydrolysis is just a fancy name for a chemical reaction involving water. ATP, adenosine triphosphate, donates or loses a phosphate molecule to form ADP and free phosphate. And that reaction is very energetically favorable, and it is used to drive unfavorable reactions in the body, energetically unfavorable reactions. Many, many enzymes are ATP dependent. And the reason the body uses ATP as its energy currency is because if we were relying on little micro explosions in our bodies to power things, it probably wouldn't go very well. I don't think life would have made it very far. And so think about like monetary currency. If it's back in like the 1200s, for example, and I'm a cobbler, I sell shoes and I need a new sword and I go over to the swordsmith and he doesn't need a new pair of shoes, how am I supposed to get a new sword? I don't have an efficient way to transfer that value. And that's why currency was developed, because it is basically in its purest form an exchange of value. I acknowledge this currency represents a certain value and I am giving it to you so that I can get something I want. In the body, ATP is the body's energy currency, and it allows the transfer of energy. So if you consume more energy than you expend, that chemical energy stored in the bonds of food gets transferred throughout multiple chemical reactions to essentially get stored. The excess gets stored in adipose tissue as triacylglycerides. If you expend more energy than you consume, and there is an energy deficit, your body then has to liberate that energy from adipose tissue in order to then power the reactions in the body to produce ATP. Think about bears. When bears hibernate for the winter, they eat a bunch of food, they get really fat, and then they don't have to eat. And this even works for people. As weird as it sounds, there is a case of a man who did not eat for 365 days. He was obese when he started, and I think he lost like 150 pounds in a year. He didn't eat, and he was fine. I mean, probably was hard socially, but he didn't eat. And this is another reason why when people say, these low calorie diets for obese people are bad for them, it's going to harm their health. Well, you have to keep in mind, if you have a lot of adipose tissue, you're not going to be low on energy because you already have the energy. You have stored energy for weeks, months, possibly even years in adipose tissue. Now, why can't you just store ATP? Well, it would be really, really inefficient. It's a relatively large molecule and you can't pack them really close together because of the energetics. Whereas triacylglycerides, you can pack a lot in a very small area and it's a very stable molecule. And then you can liberate it, take it through the process of beta oxidation to acetyl-CoA, put it in the Krebs cycle, and produce ATP. Hey, it's Dr. Layne Norton here, and if you are tired of fad diets, bro science, and spinning your wheels in the gym, it's time to work with the pros. Team Biolayne provides custom, one-on-one, science-based nutrition and training coaching. No cookie cutter plans, no BS. Just real science, real results, and my team of expert coaches who actually know what they are doing. Whether you're trying to build muscle, lose fat, or just stop yo-yo dieting, our team of expert coaches have helped thousands of people just like you get real results and sustain them. So if you are tired of spinning your wheels and you are ready to take your fitness journey seriously, head to the link in the show notes or go to biolayne.com/coaching and apply to work with Team Biolayne today. We don't guess, we assess. So we've talked a lot about energy balance thus far, and energy balance is the energy you consume versus the energy you expend. Sounds pretty straightforward, but it actually is a lot more complicated than you might think. Now, energy in is more straightforward. It's the calories you consume minus the non-metabolizable calories. Not all the calories you take in are available to enter metabolism. There are portions of food, substances in food that are non-digestible that still contain calories, but you can't extract the energy from them. This is non-metabolizable energy. Something like insoluble fiber is a great example of that. For the most part, insoluble fiber is not metabolizable and you cannot capture the calories from it. So your energy in, your metabolizable energy in, is the amount of calories you take in minus whatever you lose in your stool, essentially. Now, energy out is far more complicated. That is your total energy expenditure, your TEE. And that involves your resting energy expenditure, which is the biggest bucket of your total energy expenditure. So your total energy expenditure is all the calories you burn on a daily basis. It encapsulates all of the calories you expend. Your resting energy expenditure is the largest portion of that bucket, and for most people is around 50 to 70% of your TEE. And that is the amount of energy you expend just at rest, if I were to lay down on this table, not sleep, but just lay down on this table and just breathe and do nothing else, if I did that for 24 hours, the amount of calories I burned, that's my resting energy expenditure. Then you have TEF, or the thermic effect of food. And that is the energy you have to put into digestion, absorption, metabolism in order to get the energy out of food. And that accounts for like 5 to 10% of your daily energy expenditure, and depends on your diet composition. Then you have your physical activity, and that falls into 2 buckets. The first one is very obvious, your exercise, which is purposeful activity. The second one is not so obvious. It is your non-exercise activity thermogenesis, and this involves all unconscious and non-purposeful movements, fidgeting, posture, pacing, any kind of unpurposeful movement falls under the bucket of NEAT. I hear people say, well, I'm going to take the stairs today, get my NEAT up. That's not NEAT. If you are choosing to do it, it's not NEAT, it's exercise. And this distinction is important because a lot of people, when I talk about how NEAT is modifiable, and we're going to talk about this here in a minute, they'll say, well, just do more NEAT. Well, you can't really just do more NEAT. You can do more purposeful physical activity. You can choose to increase your physical activity through purposeful physical activity, but that is different. NEAT is completely unconscious and you are not aware that you're doing it. And then you have your exercise activity, which is your purposeful movement, which is very straightforward. Okay, now here's the thing about all these buckets and total energy expenditure. It is not a set number. It is modifiable, and it does change quite a bit. In fact, people think about calories in, calories out as 2 set numbers that don't change, as independent variables. The fact is they are dependent variables, and a change in one affects the change in another, and it appears to go both ways. Example, if you are overfeeding, your energy expenditure increases. If you are underfeeding or in a calorie deficit, your energy expenditure decreases. If you increase your physical activity, your energy intake may change. So these are interdependent variables. And here's the other rub. The degree to which they change can vary quite a bit between individuals. In fact, it's thought that people who are obese resistant tend to just dissipate excess energy through spontaneous physical activity, or NEAT. In fact, there was one study I'm thinking of where they overfed people by like 1,000 calories a day for 8 weeks. And one person in the study basically didn't gain any weight. And they didn't tell these people to change their body movements, nothing like that. This person just spontaneously, because of overfeeding, drastically increased their energy expenditure. And there is evidence that if you lose, for example, 10% of your body weight, your resting energy expenditure can drop by about an average of 15%, but it varies from individuals. So some will be less than that, some will be more than that. But the average is about 15%. And if you lose 10% of your body weight, your NEAT can drop by up to 400 calories per day. So let's just do a thought experiment here. Myself, I maintain my body weight on around 3,300 to 3,400 calories a day. Consistently will maintain around 205 pounds of body weight. So what I maintain my body weight on, that's my total energy expenditure. It's between 3,300 and 3,400 calories per day. Because if I'm maintaining my body weight, that is how many calories I'm expending per day. I'm in energy balance. Let's say I wanted to lose weight, and let's say I lost 10% of my body weight. My resting energy expenditure is around 2,000 calories a day. It's actually more like 1,900, but we'll just say 2,000 for easy math. So if I lost 10% of my body weight and my REE went down by 15%, it would go from 2,000 to 1,700. Then if I lost 400 calories off my NEAT from 10% body weight loss, if we add those two together, that's 700 calories, a 700 calorie reduction in my total energy expenditure. 700 calories, if I went from taking in, say, 3,300 calories to 2,600 calories, that's a pretty good deficit for me, and I'll lose quite a bit of weight. But by the end of that diet of losing 10% of body weight, what was originally a pretty substantial calorie deficit is actually maintenance now. And again, this is one of those things that tries to drive you back to your pre-diet weight. And so this is one of the reasons that people will say, well, I tried a calorie deficit and it didn't work. They don't realize that energy expenditure is adaptable. And people get confused because they'll go to an online calculator for fat loss and it will spit out a number and they'll go, well, I ate that number and I didn't lose weight. Okay, well, what do you think is more likely, that you are violating the laws of physics or that maybe that online calculator didn't give you a number that was right for you? I'm going to take the latter bet. This doesn't mean that calorie deficits don't work. It just means that the amount of calories they were taking in wasn't a deficit for them. That leads me to my next point, which is tracking errors. Tracking errors or underreporting is the largest reason that people don't believe calorie deficits work. And this one really pisses people off. But it has been shown time and time and time again in research studies, and especially in a very classic study in nutrition that was published in the New England Journal of Medicine, looking at the discrepancy between self-reported calorie intake versus actual calorie intake in obese people who claimed they could not lose weight on low calories. So these were people, I believe they claimed they were eating 1,200 calories a day. And the researchers had them in a metabolic ward where they could track like literally everything, their food intake, their energy expenditure, everything. And one, they found that these people did not have slower metabolisms. And in fact, obese people overall actually have faster metabolisms than lean people. But when you standardize for the increased body mass, because they have a faster metabolism because they have more body mass they're carrying around, when you standardize for their lean body mass, their lean tissue, they basically have the same metabolic rate as lean people. So obese people don't have slow metabolisms. And even obese people with type 2 diabetes don't have slower metabolisms than people who are lean. They didn't have slower metabolisms. What explained their lack of weight loss was that on average, they underreported their calorie intake by 53%. And they overreported their physical activity by 47%. Even dietitians who are experts at tracking food, they underreport by 10% on average. So when people say I was eating in a calorie deficit and didn't lose weight, no, you were eating what you thought was a calorie deficit. But if you didn't lose weight, by definition, it wasn't a calorie deficit. The next thing that can be confusing for people is these wrist-worn devices that tell you how many calories you burn, or the Stairmaster telling you how many calories you burn, or an online calculator telling you how many calories you burned. These devices in general have an error of anywhere from about 30 to 90%. They overestimate calories burned from exercise. So again, when people say, well, I burn 1,000 calories in the gym and I'm not losing weight. Well, what's more likely, that you are violating the laws of physics, or that maybe your watch isn't accurate? Because again, I'm going to take the latter if I'm going to bet. Sporadic weigh-ins are another reason that people don't think calorie deficits work. People will start a diet. They'll weigh in some random time a week later and they'll say, I gained 1.5 pounds. See, it's not working. Body weight changes on a day-to-day basis are much more influenced by fluid dynamics than they are the actual change in tissue mass. If you want to know if your tissue mass is actually changing, I recommend weighing yourself daily and then looking at the average for the week and comparing averages. That is much more reflective of the loss or gain of tissue mass. Because if you've ever taken your body weight every day, you know it bounces all over the place. Like my body weight will fluctuate regularly within a 5-pound range. Even if I'm weighing in first thing in the morning after going to the bathroom, before eating food, even if I'm doing that consistently. And some people don't realize that if you weigh in the afternoon, you weigh more. Yeah, when you eat food, drink water, that has mass, you will weigh more. So I recommend weighing in frequently in the morning after avoiding your bladder and bowel if you can, before you eat, taking that weight and then looking at the averages and comparing averages. Because again, I could have just weighed in on a day where I had a high fluctuation thinking a diet isn't working, when in reality, my overall average weight loss might have been like over 1 pound for the week. But I'm just looking at that one data point, it's going to look funky, or I'm going to think it's not working. It's like the stock market. Stock market goes like this. If you just zoom in and look at one data point or one day in the stock market, and you go, oh my God, this investment's down by 10%. but over the course of the week or the month, it's up by 15%. Do you care about the day, or do you care about the average over the week or the month? You care about the average. So sporadic weigh-ins can confuse people with this stuff. People also like to claim that hormones can make them resistant to weight loss. It is true that some hormones can have an impact on energy expenditure and appetite. But again, those are accounted for in energy balance. For example, thyroid hormone, people who have hypothyroidism can have a reduction in their resting energy expenditure by up to 25% per day. That doesn't mean calorie deficits don't work for them. It just means that the threshold for creating a calorie deficit for somebody with untreated hypothyroidism is lower than what it would be for somebody who's not. So if your REE, for example, is 1,600 calories a day normally, but you're somebody with hypothyroidism, that makes it 1,200. That just means that your threshold for creating a calorie deficit is going to be 400 calories lower than a comparable person who's not having untreated hypothyroidism. Again, it doesn't mean that you can't create a calorie deficit. It just makes it harder if it's untreated. So hormones do matter, but a lot of people use them as this blanket scapegoat as to why a diet won't work for them, and it's just not true. Again, energy balance captures all explanations for weight gain or loss, which is why patients who are examined under extremely rigid conditions in weight loss trials consistently lose weight. So what else is important for weight loss? Exercise. Now, everybody knows, okay, you exercise, you burn more calories. It increases your energy expenditure, and that can be helpful. But it's not a perfect additive effect. In fact, there's research that shows that one, when you exercise, you tend to eat a little bit more. It's not a full compensation, meaning if you burn 100 calories from exercise, you don't then compensate by eating 100 calories. It's a small compensation. And also, the research on total energy expenditure suggests that when you exercise, there is also a partial compensation through probably your resting energy expenditure and NEAT for that exercise. So if you do 100 calories of exercise per day, what you net out in terms of extra calories burned is about 72 on average, based on Herman Pontzer's data. That's still a net benefit, but it's smaller than you'd expect. And when we do weight loss trials with exercise, often and typically the amount of weight people lose from exercise is less than what is expected based on how many calories they should be burning, because there is a little bit of a constrained energy expenditure model, meaning that if you increase your exercise, your body will try to compensate in other ways to not burn as many calories. But again, on average, it is still a net benefit to exercise because you will burn more calories overall. It's just not a perfect additive effect. So while exercise can increase total energy expenditure, really the reason you should exercise, well, one, it's healthy. It has a myriad of health benefits outside of weight loss. You don't even have to lose weight to get more healthy when you're exercising. But the biggest benefit for weight loss is it actually appears to sensitize you to satiety signals. If you look at activity levels and calorie intake, it's actually kind of a J-shaped curve, where at low levels of activity or sedentary, people actually eat more than they do at like moderately active levels. So there's something that happens with exercise where your brain responds better to its own satiety signals. And exercise is one of the only modalities we're aware of that can change your what's called your body fat set point. Now, there is some debate over whether body fat set point is a real thing or not. I tend to think that more of it's true than false, but I think that the entire model is not perfect. But essentially, body fat set point is the idea that your body has kind of this natural body fat level or body fat range it likes to sit in. And if you get too low, it'll fight you. And if you get too high, it'll fight you. But it appears to fight harder with you reducing body fat than gaining body fat, which makes sense from an evolutionary perspective. Over the course of a million years of human evolution, the most significant threat to our survival has been starvation. And when you're looking at what are the risks of getting too lean versus the risk of getting too fat, the risk of getting too lean is you die from starvation. The risk of getting too fat is you're at greater risk of predation, of being caught by a predator. That hasn't really been a threat for like the last 10,000 years once we learned how to use tools. And so it makes sense that the constraints on trying to keep you in your range of body fat set point are tighter on the low end than they are on the high end of body fat. And we have data looking at adipose hormones like leptin. Leptin is a hormone that really very much master controls appetite. And when you gain body fat, you secrete more leptin. It decreases your appetite. When you lose body fat, adipose tissue or adipocytes shrink, secrete less leptin, and it makes you more hungry. So it's kind of like your thermostat. If you overeat to a certain extent, leptin goes up, you're less hungry, you eat less, and it keeps you in range. If you undereat, you lose weight, leptin goes down, you get hungrier, drive to eat goes up, and it puts you back into your original range. Just like a thermostat, if the temperature goes above, say you have it set at 75, hits 77, boom, thermostat kicks on, air conditioning kicks on, kicks you back down. Get down to 73 degrees, heater kicks on, boom, kicks you back up to 75. So think about it like a body fat thermostat. It's not a perfect model, but I tend to think that more of it's true than not. In accordance with exercise being important for weight loss, we see that amongst successful weight loss maintainers, over 85% of them engage in regular exercise compared to those who do not. So exercise appears to be very important. Regular exercise appears to be important for the loss of body fat. All right, next thing that's important, we kind of covered this already, but self-monitoring is a very, very consistent characteristic of successful weight loss maintainers is that they practice regular self-monitoring. And that can be weighing themselves, tracking their food, weighing their food. Any kind of self-monitoring can help, and even multiple levels of self-monitoring. Like, for example, I weigh myself daily. I track most of my food. And people who practice self-monitoring are much more likely to lose weight and keep it off compared to those who don't. Self-monitoring alone appears to change behavior. If you just have obese people weigh themselves, you will see, on average, they'll start to lose weight. Again, it's kind of like instant feedback. But I think a lot of us would rather hide our heads in the sand than like face a hard truth, right? But I'm going to quote or paraphrase Tyrion Lannister. It is better to acknowledge a hard truth and face it head on than try to pretend it doesn't exist. And again, that which gets measured can get managed. So it can be hard to look and see what's going on, just like people don't like to look at a budget or their expenses because it's tough to know, hey, I'm spending, $1,000 a month eating out or whatever it is. That can be hard. But if you know it, then you can make adjustments to move towards something better. Now, the macronutrients. Do macros matter? Answer short, yes, but not nearly as much as just being in a calorie deficit. The caloric deficit is the most important thing to create weight loss. But the composition of the calorie deficit does appear to matter. The first and most important thing in terms of the composition of the calorie deficit is your protein intake. So we talked about the thermic effect of food earlier. Protein appears to have a higher TEF response, around 20 to 30%, compared to carbohydrates, 5 or 10%, or fats, 0 to 3%. Meaning, if you eat 100 calories from protein, you're netting out 70 to 80. You eat 100 calories from carbohydrate, you're netting out about 90 to 95. If you eat 100 calories from fat, you're netting out about 97 to 100. High protein diets, over 1.6 grams per kilogram of body weight, have been shown to cause better fat loss and retention of lean body mass compared to lower or moderate protein diets. And high protein diets may produce better satiety, but the effect isn't always consistent. And it probably depends on the individual source of protein. For example, if you're eating a protein bar, that may be less satiating than a comparable amount of calories from, say, fruits and vegetables. Even though it's more protein in the protein bar is ultra processed, has a different mouthfeel, and satiety isn't just about the macronutrients. It's about a lot of different things. But on balance, it appears that of the 3 macronutrients, all things being equal, protein has a better effect on satiety than carbohydrate or fat. As we discussed earlier, how many carbs you consume versus fats doesn't seem to matter for fat loss when protein and calories are equated. maybe a slight advantage for low-fat diets, because carbohydrates and fats are essentially just two different like energy fillers essentially. So when it comes to like setting up a fat loss diet, and this is how Carbon Diet Coach does it, it's how it's discussed in my book, Fat Loss Forever. But once you know what your calorie deficit needs to be and how many calories you consume, you should calculate protein first, subtract those calories from your overall calorie intake, and then you have the calories left over to distribute to carbs and fats. And so you should distribute those kind of based on what your dietary preference is. If you're more of a savory person, you can go a little bit higher fat, lower carb. If you're more of a starchy person, you go higher carb, lower fat. But adherence, remember, is the number one priority. But that being said, carbohydrate and fat intake, even though it doesn't appear to matter for fat loss, the type of carbohydrate probably matters, because high fiber diets have been demonstrated to improve fullness, satiety, and decrease spontaneous food intake. So just to go back to the basic steps of developing a fat loss diet, how many calories do you need first to induce a calorie deficit in the level that you want? Determine your protein intake, subtract those calories from your overall calorie intake, and then with the remaining calories for carbohydrates and fats, a lot based on what your dietary preference is and what you feel will be easiest to stick to for you. And make sure you get a sufficient amount of fiber. I typically recommend around 15 grams per 1,000 calories of dietary intake. Now, the next topic I didn't have on my original pyramid is sleep. And sufficient sleep appears to improve appetite regulation, whereas sleep deprivation or restriction spontaneously increases calorie intake. In fact, in one study, I think it was sleep restriction of 2/3 of normal sleep for 8 days actually caused spontaneous increase in calories of over 500 calories a day. That's pretty massive. And this appears to be explained through changes in hunger hormone secretion in response to insufficient sleep. If you sleep restrict, it appears to increase levels of ghrelin, and ghrelin is a hormone that increases your hunger and drive to eat. And this increase in calories appears to be from increased snacking, not necessarily increased meal size. When they do acute studies of sleep restriction looking at meal intake, the calorie intake appears to be similar, but people tend to snack much more when they haven't had enough sleep. And sleep restriction can also change the composition of weight loss, with people who are sleep restricted losing more weight from lean mass and less from fat than those who get sufficient sleep. In fact, in one study of 2 weeks of sleep restriction, I think it was 5 hours, less than 5 hours versus 8 hours. In the group getting 8 hours of sleep, almost 100% of the weight that was lost was from body fat. But in the group getting less than 5 hours, almost half of it was lost from lean mass and half from fat mass. That's a pretty drastic change in composition. Now, when I say enough sleep, if you look at the research data, you don't need to get 8, 9, 10 hours of sleep. But the research data on mortality, on disease, in terms of optimal levels of sleep, it appears to be around 7 hours, 7 to 8 hours. If you get above or below that, you do see increased disease risk and mortality risk. But what's crazy is the risk increase is greater going above 8 hours of sleep versus going below 7 hours of sleep. Meaning, I think the papers I looked at saw, for example, going below 7 hours of sleep, there was like a 5% increased risk of, I think it was cardiovascular disease or mortality for each hour less of sleep you got. But above 8 hours, it was like close to a 10% increased risk in mortality. So again, you don't have to get excessive amounts of sleep. And sleep can be individual too. What I recommend to people and what I tell people is, if you are naturally waking up and you're going to bed at a consistent time and your body is able to naturally wake up and you feel good, you feel rested on 6 or 6.5 or 7 hours of sleep, that's totally fine. If you need more to feel totally rested, that's also fine. But excessive sleep appears to have risks for mortality and disease as well. Now let's talk supplements. This is probably where a lot of the emphasis gets put, and there's not much evidence. In fact, there's really only a few supplements that have any real evidence to suggest that they can cause fat loss. The first one is ephedra, which tends to result in about, on average, a loss of 1 kilogram of body weight, but may have adverse effects, and I believe has been banned since for around 20 years. Maybe some countries still allow it. I'm not sure. There are some derivatives that are still available in that sort of same category, but 1 kilogram is a pretty modest effect. Creatine supplementation, funny enough, a lot of people are worried about using on a fat loss diet, actually, on average, reduces body fat levels by about 0.5%. And melatonin supplementation appears to reduce body fat levels by about 0.5%, which is why my supplement line, Outward Nutrition, has a creatine-containing supplement, Recovery, as well as a melatonin-containing supplement, Sleep. So again, can help with those goals, but it's not, as you can see, these are not massive effects. These are not big effects. They're not going to be a huge mover of the needle. And again, as we've already talked about, the effects of melatonin on body fat reduction may be secondary to improved sleep and better appetite regulation. Creatine may also have a mediating variable of if you increase lean mass, but your body weight stays the same, then you actually by default lose body fat. All right, guys, that's the deep dive on fat loss and what really matters for fat loss. Hope this has been helpful for you guys. Again, if you're interested in an even deeper dive, you can check out my book, Fat Loss Forever. If you don't really care about deep diving, but you want a tool to help you lose body fat, my app, Carbon Diet Coach. We've had people lose over 100 pounds using the app. We've had people prep for bodybuilding shows using the app, win pro cards using the app. Carbon Diet Coach takes all the guesswork out of it, all the math out of it. You just follow the numbers and you lose body fat. Or if you want to gain weight, we have that option on there too. Maintenance, reverse diet. You have all those options. But remember, when it comes to weight loss, the most important thing is adherence. And the best diet for you is probably the one you can stick to. And any form of diet is going to have some form of restriction, whether it's a dietary restriction like keto or plant-based, or it's a time restriction like intermittent fasting, or it's a calorie tracking restriction, a tracking restriction, as in like tracking your calories and making sure you're in a calorie deficit. There's some form of restriction that's going to be required. But you should probably choose the form of restriction that feels the least restrictive for you, the easiest for you, because the best diet for fat loss is the one that you can consistently adhere to. Hey guys, if you love the podcast, make sure you leave us a 5-star review or whatever star review on whatever streaming platform you listen to it on. If you're on YouTube, give us a thumbs up, like the podcast. Please leave a review, share it with your friends. Hope you guys enjoyed it, and I'll catch you on the next episode.